Hi, welcome to another session of Cop Talk. Larry Levin here with Bob Cohn and our producer Mike Sherwin. Looks like Vladimir Putin has ordered his troops to pull back in the eastern Ukraine now. What do you make of that?
I hope he is sincere, because I think this situation where Russia has been taking huge bites out of Ukraine has really escalated beyond what even he might have anticipated.
So speculate why you think he might be doing that.
I think the reality, first of all, NATO has moved some troops into the Balkan states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia.
Yeah.
Those three are members of NATO. And, he came really close. He was following Hitler's playbook all the way up through and including the plebiscite in Crimea. The question is, where will his Poland be? When Hitler went into Poland, that triggered World War II, God forbid. So I think perhaps some people around him became skittish. Maybe the sanctions against his kleptocratic cronies has influence. I don't really know. It's hard to read his mind.
Well, isn't there also, people have said, they speculated that Putin himself has a vast fortune stowed, somewhere or somewheres overseas.
Yeah.
And maybe he was starting to feel the personal heat as well. I don't know.
The violence in various cities, and I think the aggressive Ukrainian pushback, was something that maybe none of us really anticipated.
Do you think there is any legitimate beef that native or ethnic Russians have about their treatment?
I don't really know whether there's a pre-existing condition of legitimate beef. I think that minority communities within larger states often feel devalued and disrespected. There was some legitimacy to that, but certainly not enough to justify trying to alter the borders of the post-Cold War Europe by force, by the threat of force.
Let's go from further north to further south. So last week, John Kerry essentially apologized for use of the word apartheid to describe a possible future for Israel. So let's talk about where the harm was and whether the harm was substantive or rhetorical. In other words, people don't want to hear the word apartheid used with respect to Israel, nowhere, no how, even in a hypothetical sense, because they think it emboldens Israel's enemies. So what do you think, and do you think that an Israeli future without a peace deal that resembles a South African past is a risk or possible?
I really don't think such a risk is possible, even worst case scenario, although I think that the expansion of the settlements on an ongoing basis is not good for the overall prospects of a two-state solution. Kerry certainly knows better than to have used such a term in these days where everything is recorded and released immediately.
Yeah.
So it was not a total accident that he used the term, it was an accident that it was leaked. And a gaffe is when a political figure says what he really means with a camera rolling.
Yeah, and the reporter even, I forget who the reporter writes for, but basically wrote a subsequent response that said, I don't apologize at all. There was no, the guy had been in journalism for 20 years. He had never been accused of leaking information that was off the record. Said there was not a specific indication it was off the record, and he went with it.
Well, we used to have a joke in the Jewish world. Anything at a Jewish meeting that they said was off the record is in yesterday's New York Times and tomorrow's Jerusalem Post.
Now there's a very serious allegation in the news, namely that Shimon Peres and Mahmoud Abbas reached a deal 3 years ago, and that Bibi torpedoed it. So is that something that ought to be brought out, and if true, what might it mean to Israel in peace?
It should be brought out. Peres is the walking Benjamin Franklin of Israel now. He's the only head of state who's 90 plus years old, and he is a real statesman. It is not his official role. He's not the head of the government. He's the head of state. So it would have been inappropriate for him to have reached a quote-unquote peace deal. On the other hand, for him to have reached a peace understanding with the head of the Palestinian Authority is significant, and certainly the background of it should be brought to light.
I mean, I think the background was, he didn't have the authority. They had reached parameters that they both believed could work, was presented to Bibi. The quartet would have to bless it at the time. Bibi said, let's wait and see if the quartet produces a better deal, and a few days later, Bibi basically nixed it.
Yeah, well, I need to know more about it before I'm ready to point fingers at Bibi.
Fine.
He's had several occasions in which he appeared to be torpedoing it. I think Obama tried to blame both the Palestinians and the Israelis for the latest breakdown. A lot of work went into all of this, and I don't think it was all in vain. And I do give Kerry, despite the apartheid gaffe, all the credit in the world for trying, and I think after a cooling off period, there can be a resumption.
In some ways, I think Israel gets blamed for being a state, and a state that is knowledgeable and intelligent. And in other words, what I'm saying is, I don't think the criticisms are equal. I think because Israel has produced this incredible state with all of its accomplishments, I think when the international community sometimes looks at the settlement problem, they say, you ought to be able to fix that.
Yes.
And then Israel, sometimes from an anti-Semitic perspective, but sometimes not, Israel takes the hit because of being a very enlightened society, whereas you've had much more chaos in terms of political leadership, obviously not a sovereign, two different groups running two different parts of the Palestinian territories. They maybe don't get held to the same political standard by the world. I don't know.
And we also have the reality of Hamas, officially listed by our own state, by Kerry's State Department and Hillary's State Department as a terrorist and by the EU. They have engaged in kidnapping. If we remember Gilad Shalit, and the world is recoiling, and you may have something in your list about the horrible kidnapping in Nigeria of over 200 schoolgirls. And this is an organization that has made a career of kidnapping, intimidation, and devaluing Western values. And I think that was the idea of an even-handed blame when Abbas made this deal with Hamas was not appropriate.
What is your opinion about J Street not being voted into the Conference of Jewish Presidents?
I think Abe Foxman did the right thing, although he had serious reservations and policy disagreements with J Street. He believes in a big tent approach, and I think it was a mistake for them to have been voted down. I have my own reservations. I lean more towards the AIPAC perspective than to J Street, but there's some really good people within J Street, well-motivated people, and I think it would have been better for the organized Jewish community had they been admitted.
I agree with you, although Jeremy Ben-Ami then, used his typical inflammatory rhetoric after they were not voted in.
Yeah.
Basically saying, well, I guess you've just defined the limits of, who's an Israel supporter and who isn't. I don't really think that his follow-up was probably appropriate, but I do agree that they probably should have been included.
And unfortunately, his response was somewhat typical of some of the hard-left critics of Israel, is that they try to say that they're the ones who are being muzzled and silent. I have felt that those of us who have kind of a traditional supportive policy toward Israel now in a 66th year, we're the ones who are being muzzled and silent. So there's been a kind of a shoe is on the other foot for them.
Well, then there's a very definite intergenerational shift and difference in perceptions based on Israel, whether you're 20 or you're 60 these days.
No question about that.
So John Huntsman wrote a splendid op-ed in the Times that called on his Republican Party to separate belief from science and embrace a reasoned and useful response to climate change. So my question to you is, aren't beliefs, in quotation marks, really for the realm of religion in discussing God, whereas science is really something that should inform intelligent public policy? And how did we get here?
Well, there was certainly validity for what John Huntsman said. I had worked for a guy named Larry Roos of blessed memory who represented that moderate, progressive, good government wing of the Republican Party, of which Huntsman is a prime example. And there is very valid science in favor of the idea that climate change is adversely affected by human behavior, and there are things we need to do about that. And I think we've gotten into our rhetorical zero-sum game where there's a knee-jerk response on the part of the Republican Party to any kind of the most recent White House report that seemed to corroborate understood knowledge about climate change and was pounced upon immediately.
But I'm concerned about this rhetorical issue because once you call something a belief, then you can just counter it with your own personal belief, whatever that is. Whereas if something is scientific fact and stays in the realm of scientific fact, then it's something that you can build public policy on. So it seems to me a very deliberate rhetorical exercise on the part of those who don't like certain things that we're trying to accomplish from a public policy perspective. It's like referring to Colombo's definition of a theory, right?
Yes.
Colombo's definition, his theory was really a hunch, right?
Yeah.
That's not a scientific theory, which is based on reams of data that's been examined and tested and proved, right?
Yeah, but I don't think it helps, and there was a thoughtful piece op-ed in the New York Times by two scientists who believe in climate change.
Believe, accept.
except that they say that to present, for example, this cave-in that where these cars went into and Ann Curry, who's a terrific journalist, I really respect her work, but they seize upon the wildfires that happen every year in California and present them as evidence of climate change caused by humans. And I don't think that, these guys say, don't just seize upon the latest tornado as an example of why we must take action with respect to...
Oh no, and in fact opponents will do equally bizarre things. They'll say, well, it was such a cold winter. Well, it was a cold winter in North America. It was the 2013 was the fourth warmest year in recorded history. Those are the kinds of data, those are the kinds of trends that scientifically can be looked at to start to explain how what's happening and how we respond to it. You know, not whether one day the weather is hot or cold.
Yeah, I remember when Obama came back from Copenhagen in the dead of winter, and the opponents said, well, look, how could there be global warming when we have such a harsh winter?
It's ridiculous.
So both sides have used that.
The Supreme Court reached a decision on the city of Greece, New York, allowing prayer before a public meeting, even if the predominant voices that led the prayers used very specific religious words, like Jesus or Son of God, and even if most of the prayers came from one particular faith tradition. What are your thoughts?
You know, I think it was a serious setback, and you wrote an excellent editorial in this week's Jewish Light on that topic. The paradigm case was Engel against brutality in 1962, and the Supreme Court majority ruled that organized prayer in public schools, and that ruling apparently still stands, but if they say, well, Jewish kids and atheists and Muslims and Buddhist kids could be excused, and the Supreme Court language was, yes, they can be. They would be immediately blamed as pariahs for being unfaithful. Mm-hmm. And there's also the idea of triumphalism, of feeling devalued. There is another side to it, where is it appropriate to ask a Catholic priest or a Protestant minister whose faith is predicated on the belief in the divinity of Jesus to purge their prayers in a sequential series of any references to Jesus. Mm-hmm. So my own thinking is somewhat evolving on that latter point, but the overall constitutional point, I think, was a bad call.
Well, and the rule in Greece, New York, did not require that they purge at all.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, the vast majority of those prayers that were given were Christian prayers. Exactly. So, you know, we don't even know if an imam came to the city of Greece and said, "Can I present the prayer and utilize, faith to Allah?"
Yeah.
You know, would that be permitted? Or if an atheist presented a prayer, or, you know, crazy example, if a Satanist wanted to deliver a prayer, or a Scientologist wanted to deliver a prayer, would that be acceptable?
And by the way, the Scientology group was admitted to the Interfaith Partnership,
right,
because it's recognized as an official religion.
I know.
So it's a slippery slope. It
is a totally slippery slope. And, you know, if we're sitting in a city where there's a majority, let's say, Muslim population, you know, how would those Christian leaders, who seem to be okay with it in Greece, New York, how would they feel if all of a sudden 75 or 85% of the prayers were Muslim in nature? We don't know. We dare say it might not go over particularly well.
And what if a Haredi rabbi offered a prayer in which he said, "The faith of Moshe Rabbeinu is the only faith that is worthy of respect. Amen." Would that go over well or not?
Probably not. So thank you. Thank Mike Sherwin, our producer. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Good. I thought that went nicely.
Thanks, guys.
Rhythmed.